Okay, thank you very much, Prakash, and thank you for inviting me to address you on the history of caste, or its discovery, in inverted commas, during the colonial period. Let me just say first that my own research as an anthropologist has been done entirely in India, and not among South Asians in Britain, so I have no expert academic knowledge of South Asians in Britain, and therefore no academic credentials for expressing an opinion about whether caste discrimination should or should not be made illegal. After taking retirement from the LSE, early retirement, I decided to start working on the history of the anthropology of India, and this paper, as Prakash said, is part of that work. And so what I want to do is describe, rather than engage in all the arguments about Orientalism and colonialism and post-colonialism and so on which exist, describe the way the British understood and researched caste and its influence on the way in which caste has been understood by both Indians and foreigners ever since. So almost all the work that was done in India on ethnographic topics, including caste, was done by officials, primarily members of the Indian Civil Service, the ICS. So it was a government-sponsored investigation. It's not until the late 1920s that independent, largely academically based researchers, Indians and non-Indians, began to investigate it. So there is a kind of official monopoly on the research into caste, which lasts from the early period, the 19th century, up to around the 1920s. And the British officials always insisted that the ethnographic data that they were collecting and the research that they were pursuing had two purposes. One was academic. It was to contribute to scientific knowledge of Indian society, and the other was political and administrative. It was to contribute to the good government of India, which of course also meant the maintenance of imperial rule. And the impetus for this latter part of the inquiry was the aftermath of the Great Rebellion, the Indian Mutiny as the British called it, which they strongly believed had been provoked by the violation of Indian caste and religious traditions. This, of course, was the whole point about the greased cartridges. And therefore, in order to prevent this happening again, it was necessary to collect information about caste and religious traditions so that the rulers of India didn't inadvertently violate them and trigger off another revolt. And the main vehicle for collecting this information was the census. The first decennial census was held in 1871 to 2, and of course those decennial censuses in the first year of the decade have continued ever since. Now, in the late 1850s, after the rebellion and the proclamation of Crown rule, there was very little accurate information about how the caste system actually worked or what its structure really was. The general assumption was that the classical model of the Varnas, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the Vaishyas, and the Shudras, was a description of how the system had been in a very early period, so that the system as it now existed must be a historical development, a complication of that original Varna model. And the assumptions about how this historical development had taken place depended on two taken for granted assumptions. One was social evolutionism, which was the dominant paradigm of all 19th century thought. The idea that all societies evolve through stages from the most primitive to the most advanced. And secondly, the so-called Aryan invasion or migration thesis, which you'll hear about more later. But this basically argued that Aryans, fair-skinned Aryans, speaking Indo-European languages, had invaded or migrated into India at a very early stage and had established their supremacy and over the indigenous people, the Dashus, the Dravidians, and the other indigenous inhabitants of India, so that that was the original basis of the hierarchy of the caste system. Now, the first census was not particularly satisfactory, but the second one, 1881, was much more systematic, and the classifying castes, so the point of the census, of course, is to count and classify the population. Classifying the castes remained extremely problematic. But there were two reports in 1881 which stood out from all the rest. One was Denzil Ibbetson's report on the Punjab, and the other was Athelstan Bain's on Bombay. And Ibbetson's, which became the sort of foundational text for British colonial anthropology of India, was full of ethnographic detail about the Punjabi social system, but it was also predicated on a set of arguments based, as I say, on evolutionism and the Aryan invasion thesis, which would explain how the caste system had emerged. So Ibbetson assumed, in line with standard evolutionist theory, that in primitive societies people are simply divided into tribal groups. But as they become more advanced, you get a differentiation of occupation. The division of labour becomes more complicated. This was an absolutely standard assumption of 19th century social theory. There was nothing peculiar about it in Ibbetson's work. And according to Ibbetson, the whole basis of diversity of caste is diversity of occupation. And the theory was that India, like Europe, had begun to evolve. Occupations had become more diverse. Guilds had formed. But in India, these guilds had turned into hereditary castes, whereas in Europe, they had turned into open occupational associations, which eventually became economic classes. So India and Europe started on the same track, but India turned into closed hereditary castes, and Europe turned into open social classes. And Baines's argument in the census report on Bombay was very similar, even though he provided a great deal less detailed ethnographic support for his argument. So this was the first time that any coherent theory of how the caste system as it actually existed had developed in line with the prevailing social theories of evolutionism, coupled with the Aryan invasion thesis, had been presented. And that departed from the old assumption that it was simply the Varna system which had got more complicated over time. Now, in addition to the census, a whole variety of other ethnographic projects began to develop, in which two men were particularly important: William Crook, who was a district officer in what was then the northwestern provinces, now Uttar Pradesh, and Herbert Risley, who was an important official in Bengal. And in 1885, the government of Bengal instructed Risley to carry out a comprehensive survey of the tribes and castes of Bengal, which at that stage was an enormous province, including modern Bihar and Orissa, as well as what is now West Bengal and Bangladesh. So that entire area was the province of Bengal. And Risley's survey was eventually published in 1891-2. And Risley was later appointed the commissioner in charge of the 1901 census and the honorary director of ethnography for India. So he became the most important of the official anthropologists in British India. And the government agreed to support an ethnographic survey under Risley's direction, which would eventually lead to the publication of tribes and caste volumes for every province of British India, and it was also followed in some of the princely states as well. Risley then converted his Risley then converted his census report chapters. Is it me who's causing into a book, The People of India, published in 1908, which was an extremely influential text at the time. And Risley had two particular interests. One was in the racial theory of caste, and the other was in hierarchical ranking, or what he called social precedence. Risley was a devotee of the so-called science of anthropometry, which involved taking measurements of the body, and he believed that there was a systematic correlation between these bodily measurements and rank within the caste system, so that people had different physiological features according to their rank within the caste system. Most notoriously, the shape of their noses. Thin noses were the normal attribute of high caste people, and broad noses of low caste people. And all sorts of measurements were taken which were supposed to prove this. Now, it's impossible to defend this theory because it never had any real scientific basis to it whatsoever. But it's important to note, which is not always recognized in the literature, that almost all other British officials thought that Risley was wrong, either because the statistical data simply did not support his theory, or alternatively because the entire theory was wrong in the first place. So although Risley was the most important official anthropologist in India, his central thesis that race was correlated with caste rank was not actually believed by almost all the other official anthropologists who were working on similar projects. And by the time Risley died in 1911, there were virtually no defenders of his theory left, although it has had a kind of bizarre afterlife among some Indian anthropologists who have still continued to try to make these kind of measurements. And that field, of course, has been kind of reinvented by modern DNA-based population genetics, which brings about all sorts of quite interesting hypotheses, but doesn't make a great deal of difference to the understanding of the caste system itself. Anyway, to go back to Risley's theory, the bit that continued to have a great influence was not the anthropometry, but the theory of hierarchy, of social precedence. And in the 1901 census, Risley instructed all the superintendents in all the different provinces to collect data systematically on social rank. How were the castes ranked in these different areas? And Risley criticized the occupational division of labor theory, which Ibbotson and Baines and some others have put forward, arguing, with some justification it has to be said, that that theory could not explain the way the caste system had developed or how it actually worked. What the caste system was really based upon was hierarchical rank, and that castes were essentially endogamous groups. What was far more important than their occupations was the practice of endogamy, that is, marrying only within your own caste group, and that preserved the separation of the different castes, which were then ranked according to a series of instituted practices and customs. So what the census superintendents had to do was collect information about these practices and customs. Now, I won't go into all the detail, but they were basically about whether Brahmins will serve food, whether Brahmins will accept food from you or not, whether you can have Brahmin priests in your house or not, whether you can enter temples or not, what kind of diet you have, whether you're vegetarian or non-vegetarian, and so on and so forth. And that by collecting all this material, it would then be possible to organize the castes in a hierarchy from the top to the bottom, and a great deal of the information collected from what were quaintly called committees of native gentlemen, who were assembled in the different towns of the province and asked to check these lists. So the census superintendents would produce lists showing all the ranks of the castes in Bengal, and then a committee of native gentlemen in some district of Calcutta would then be asked to say, do you agree with this list? So the lists were a combination of the inquiries on the ground and the opinions of the so-called native gentlemen, who were, of course, almost always leaders of the community and were therefore themselves from high caste groups. The results of these inquiries in 1901 were extremely diverse. Every superintendent produced a different list with a different number of grades of castes, none of which agreed with each other, except at the most minimal level. The Brahmins tended to be at the top. In Punjab, the superintendent said this ranking system is impossible to operate in the Punjab, and therefore I'm following the old occupational system. In Bombay, the superintendent said, I'm not prepared to do this because it will provoke riots among people who've been given the wrong status. So the result was very different results, and in some provinces no results at all. Risley optimistically insisted that all sorts of valuable information had been brought by this exercise, although most of his colleagues thought it had been a damn nuisance and had caused too much trouble. But whatever the rights and wrongs of that dispute, Risley's emphasis on rank actually became crucial to the subsequent development of understandings of caste, and has remained so to this present day. So it is Risley, more than anybody else, who put hierarchy, rank, onto the intellectual agenda for understanding caste in a way that had not been so in previous years. After 1901, these castes and tribes volumes continued to be published, but in the following censuses, in 1911, 21 and 31, the census of 1941 was heavily curtailed by the political and economic problems of the war, so hardly any data was published. In the next three, 1911, 21 and 31, not much more information on caste was collected because the men in charge thought that they had enough material already, and that there were other things that were more important to study, like economic and industrial development, public health problems, and so on and so forth. And there was also, by this time, a distinct move away from the old evolutionist arguments and more interest in what we now recognize in modern sociological jargon as functionalist studies. Studies of how the system actually exists in the here and now, rather than how it emerged over time. So that in the 1921 census, very little effort was made to improve the description of castes which had been given before, and the final tables simply divided the castes in each province into Brahmins, non-Brahmins, and Untouchables. And then tribes, a separate category. And in 1931, it was much the same. Now, I'll come back to the question of the Untouchables because it's one of the most significant innovations of this entire period. But let me recapitulate on the main points. One, as I say, evolutionism, social evolutionism was the dominant paradigm in how people thought about it until they began, in a sense, to depart in the 1920s and 30s from this model. Secondly, Risley's emphasis on hierarchy became extremely important, and the understanding of caste shifted away from a concentration on occupational groups towards ranked endogamous groups. The basic understanding of what the caste system is, therefore, changed from a complex form of the division of labour to a complex system of hierarchical ranking. Now, what that also meant, which is also very important, is that for Risley, these ranking systems were predominantly Hindu. They were about whether you could enter temples, whether Brahmins would serve you, and so on and so forth. And he paid very little attention to Muslims, or to Sikhs, or any other non-Hindu groups. That meant a significant shift. The occupational theory of Ibbotson did not make religion a central criterion at all. So, for example, there was a classification, in that classification system by occupation, castes were divided into agricultural castes, merchant castes, priestly castes, etc., etc. And then within occupational castes, there would be Hindus and Muslims and Sikhs all put together. Priestly castes, of course, would have both the Brahmins and the Saids. They were dumped into the same category. So in the occupational classification of castes, religion is not a primary criterion at all. But in the hierarchical system, given that the very principle of the ranking primarily comes from Hindu criteria, it is essentially a Hindu caste theory that Risley is proposing, and Muslims and Sikhs become peripheral to it. And the distinctive properties of ranking, which Ibbotson had described in such detail for the Punjab, begin to fade from the picture entirely. And the caste system begins to be seen as a distinctively Hindu-Indian institution, which had not been in the old theory of Ibbotson and Kahn. It was essentially similar to what happened in Europe, but it diverted into a different direction. But it was essentially the same as what had happened in Europe, whereas once it becomes a distinctively Hindu hierarchical system, it becomes essentially different from the social system of Europe. Now, after 1901, as I say, the kind of material that was collected in the census has changed, but it also changed for important political reasons. The partition of Bengal in 1905 was the single most important event in stimulating the Indian nationalist movement. The Morley-Minto reforms of 1909 were an attempt to deal with rising nationalism. But then the First World War came, which of course was a catastrophic collapse of imperial confidence among the British, and also forced the British government to make further concessions to the nationalists in the so-called Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, which occurred in 1919. Now the point is that from roughly 1905, the political situation in India became extremely unstable in a way that it had not been before, so that the collection of this kind of social data became more difficult. And it also became something that there was less time to do. But the census had by this time established one thing that is very obvious, but nevertheless very important, which is that every inhabitant of India does indeed have a caste, just like they have an occupation and a religion and a family setup and what have you, which can be collected by census enumerators. The early censuses are full of information by the superintendents about how difficult it was to collect this material because so many people said, I don't know what my caste is. Or they gave the wrong answer. They gave their religion instead of their caste or whatever. But that difficulty faded away. People learnt how to answer questions in castes, in censuses, just as they do in all modern countries. In all modern countries, people now take it for granted that every 10 years the government will collect information about your occupation, your family circumstances, your household setup, your ethnic background, and so on and so forth. Just like in Britain, so in India, people have got used to this. So now everybody assumes that they have a caste in a way that simply wasn't true back in 1871 when the censuses first began. So that's a very important point, that every Indian now reckons that this is a sensible question to ask in a way that was not the case in the mid-19th century. A distinct category called untouchables and an institution of untouchability designated by those English words emerges at the very beginning of the 20th century, partly as a result of the questions which are being asked in the Caste, in the census, and partly as a result of early social reform movements, especially in Bengal and Bombay. Now, the political significance of all this becomes apparent in 1909 with the Morley-Minto reforms, which introduced separate Muslim electorates for the first time. Now, once separate Muslim electorates had been introduced, then the question of how many Muslims there were began to matter. Because obviously, in order to draw up an electorate, you have to have some idea of how many people there are who can elect members to the legislative councils of the distant provinces and the imperial government of India, because you're trying to work out an appropriate proportion. How many Muslim seats should there be? And once it becomes important to determine how many Muslims there are in India, because they have separate electorates, it obviously becomes important to Hindus to determine how many Hindus there are. And for Sikhs to determine how many Sikhs there are. And for Christians too, although Christians at this stage were not a significant group. But it becomes particularly important for Hindus to figure out how many Hindus there are. And that involves a decision about whether untouchables are also Hindus and about whether tribal peoples are also Hindus. So this is when it becomes politically controversial who are the Hindus and how many are there, given that the government has granted separate electorates to Muslims. And in the 1919 Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, a few nominated seats were also reserved for what were then called the depressed classes, i.e. untouchables. And a new category of non-Brahmins begins to emerge, mainly in Madras, Bombay, and the Mysore princely state, campaigning against Brahmin domination of government jobs and education, which is the beginning of backward class reservations. So it's from 1909, reinforced by the reforms of 1919, that the question of how many people belong to these different castes and religious groups starts to matter in a way that it never did before. One advantage, perhaps the only advantage, of imperial autocracy is that you don't have to worry about how many people there are in all these different groups, but once you have elections, you do. Then, of course, in the run-up to the negotiations for the 1935 Government of India Act, the last major reform before independence, Gandhi and Ambedkar famously argued about whether untouchables should have separate electorates from ordinary, separate electorates or not. Now, in the context of the 1935 Act preparations, the 1931 Census Commissioner, J.H. Hutton, was told, you must collect information about the numbers, the population size of all the different major caste groups, including the untouchables and the major religious groups. Hutton reported that counting untouchables was particularly difficult because there was no agreement among people in the different parts of India about who the untouchables were and what counted as untouchability. And this question of who are the untouchables remains, as much modern anthropological research shows, a problem. Or rather, to put it the other way round, which is the way it needs to be investigated, how does that category, the official category scheduled castes, correspond or not correspond to Mahars or Jatas or Paryas or all the other named, quotes, untouchable castes in India? Now, after 1947, once scheduled caste reservations is introduced and untouchability becomes illegal, then the courts in India have had to deal with this problem. But they have continued to have to deal with this problem to the present day. So I just looked up a few cases just to find any recent examples. And even last year, the Supreme Court was deciding a case, for example, on whether a person who had scheduled caste identity in one part of India kept it when she moved for a job in another part of India because her caste was not recorded as a scheduled caste in this new place to which she had moved. So these kind of problems about who are the untouchables stroke scheduled castes remain a significant legal problem in India, as they would in any other country, for example Britain, that tried to introduce similar legislation. Now let me just say finally, since my time is up, that in 1947, of course, the ICS went home. The British colonial investigation of caste and all other social topics came to an end. But in practice, as I've said, the heyday of the official investigation into caste was essentially from 1881 to 1901. After that, it began to fade away, except for the special questions that were raised, particularly in 1931 by the shortly to be legislated Government of India Act. The change after 1947 was not simply a change of personnel, it was also a change of method. By this time, evolutionism had been discredited as a theory in modern sociology and anthropology. And the anthropologists who began to work, the anthropologists and sociologists who began to work in India after 1947, both Indians and foreigners, adopted the new theories of the day, which were essentially about functionalist synchronic studies, and they mainly went to work in villages. It was systematic study of villages and their local social systems and their local caste systems that was the foundation of the modern anthropology and sociology of India. And that phase, village studies phase as it's usually referred to, lasted roughly from the 1950s to the 1970s. Since then, people have done all sorts of different things too. But this colonial literature then ceased to be of very much interest. Modern scholars still look at these old colonial books to pick out a few facts, but nobody reads them anymore to discuss their theories. Only historians do. No modern anthropologist looks up Risley to decide whether his theory is any good or not. One byproduct, however, of the fact that nobody ever does that is that people do not realize the extent to which the ideas they are currently using are, in fact, in many cases, already there in those old books. The legacy of this colonial anthropology actually remains quite significant in modern anthropology, but people no longer recognize that it's there because, for very good reasons, they've stopped reading all the old books. Thank you.